Nia Carter had spent 7 years serving the Whitfield family with quiet devotion. Now security dragged her out the front door, screaming that she stole a diamond bracelet worth more money than she made in 5 years combined. No one asked for her side. No one even looked her in the eye. That night, her 5-year-old daughter Ava found an old business card in her mother's coat pocket and dialed the private number written on the back. What that phone call uncovered would tear the entire Whitfield estate apart. Before we continue, if stories like this keep you hooked, go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Nia Carter had learned a long time ago that women like her were not allowed to make mistakes. She had started at the Whitfield estate almost 7 years earlier, hired as an hourly cleaner who was only supposed to handle the guest wing twice a week. But her work ethic set her apart almost immediately. She never left a task half-finished, never complained when the hours ran long, and never once raised her voice even when the household staff spoke to her as though she were invisible. Within 2 years, she had quietly become the person who held the entire house together, though her title and her paycheck never caught up to the responsibility she carried. She lived with her daughter Ava in a small apartment in Stamford, Connecticut, a 40-minute drive from the Whitfield property. Ava was 5 years old, bright-eyed, and endlessly curious, the kind of child who could turn a stack of empty cereal boxes into a castle taller than herself. On days when preschool was closed, Nia had no choice but to bring her along to work, tucking her into a corner of the kitchen with crayons and quiet instructions to stay out of the way. Ava never seemed to mind. She liked the big house, the tall windows, and most of all the mornings when the owner of the house actually came downstairs. Richard Whitfield was not a man who was often home. He had built a financial technology empire from nothing, and that empire now required him to be in London 1 week and Singapore the next. Most of the household staff had worked there for years without exchanging more than a few sentences with him. But Richard was not entirely detached the way people assumed. On the rare mornings he ate breakfast in the kitchen instead of his office, he noticed things. He noticed that Nia never let a single task slip, even when she was clearly exhausted. He noticed that she always asked about Ava's school, and once without being asked he mentioned that his own assistant could help arrange a better preschool schedule if Nia ever needed it. It was a small gesture, but Nia remembered it for months. It was during one of those breakfasts that Richard found Ava building her cereal box tower on the kitchen floor. He crouched down, studied her architecture with mock seriousness, and told her that if the tower ever collapsed, she could call him personally. He pulled a business card from his jacket, wrote his private cell number on the back in blue ink, and handed it to her like it was a secret between the two of them. Ava tucked the card into the pocket of her favorite jacket and kept it there for months long after she had forgotten the joke that came with it. Running the day-to-day operations of the house fell to Diane Sinclair, the estate manager who answered directly to Richard whenever he happened to be reachable. Diane was polished in front of him, always composed, always prepared with a report. But behind closed doors, she managed the staff through quiet intimidation rather than leadership. She was especially hard on Nia, finding fault in things other employees were never questioned for. If Nia brought Ava into the house on a daycare closure, Diane would mention it later, as though it were a violation. If a towel was folded incorrectly, it became a note in a file Nia never knew existed. Nia understood the pattern for what it was, but she also understood that any complaint from her would be treated very differently than the same complaint from someone else. There were other things happening beneath the surface that no one on staff had noticed yet. A few weeks before the diamond bracelet disappeared, Diane had begun taking phone calls in the hallway and ending them abruptly whenever anyone walked past. Once, when a junior housekeeper asked why Diane had returned early from an appointment, Diane snapped that it was none of her business and walked away without explanation. Another day, Richard mentioned in passing that he wanted a full inventory of the family's jewelry and valuables completed before the end of the quarter, and Diane's expression shifted for just a moment before she recovered and assured him everything would be ready. None of it seemed significant at the time. It was simply the ordinary tension of a large house running on schedules and stress. The morning everything changed started, like any other. Diane gathered the entire staff into the main hallway and announced in a voice that was calm but edged with something colder than usual that a diamond bracelet worth hundreds of thousands of dollars had gone missing from the safe in the primary dressing room. According to the estate's internal system, the safe had been opened at 9:40 in the evening the night before. Only 3 people had access to that safe: Diane herself, Nia, and a maintenance technician named Thomas Bell. Thomas was quickly cleared. He had been in Boston visiting his sister that entire week with flight records and a hotel receipt to prove it. That left 2 names, and Diane made her choice before anyone had a chance to ask a single question. She turned to Nia in front of the entire staff and said that she needed to know exactly where Nia had been the night before, her tone already suggesting she did not expect an honest answer. Nia did not hesitate. She explained that she had taken Ava to an urgent care clinic that evening because of a fever that would not break. She had the appointment confirmation on her phone. She had the receipt from the pharmacy where she picked up medicine afterward. She even offered to call the clinic directly so someone could confirm she had been sitting in their waiting room at the exact time the safe was supposedly opened. It should have been enough. In any fair conversation, it would have been enough. But Diane barely looked at the evidence Nia was holding out to her. She mentioned almost as an aside that the hallway camera near the dressing room had been having technical issues for weeks and that the footage from that night was unreliable anyway. She said it so casually that no one in the room thought to question it. Instead, Diane announced that Nia was suspended immediately pending investigation and instructed 2 of the security staff to escort her off the property. What followed was the kind of humiliation that does not leave a person all at once. Nia stood still while her bag was opened and searched in front of coworkers she had known for years, none of whom said a word in her defense. One of them, a longtime housekeeper named Carol, leaned close and whispered that Nia should just cooperate quietly so things did not get worse. Another employee, a young man who had worked beside her for over a year, suddenly found something very interesting to look at on the floor. Nia realized with a clarity that made her stomach turn that most of them had already decided she was guilty before anyone had asked a single real question. Ava stood off to the side during all of it, clutching a stuffed rabbit she had brought from home, watching her mother be treated like a criminal. She did not understand words like suspension or investigation, but she understood the shape of what was happening. She understood that her mother was being made to feel small and that no one was stopping it. When security finally walked Nia to the staff entrance, the same door she had used every single day for 7 years, nobody said goodbye. Nobody said they were sorry. The door simply closed behind her. That night, Nia sat alone at her kitchen table with a legal pad in front of her, trying to make numbers that did not add up work anyway. Rent was due in 12 days. Ava's preschool tuition was due at the end of the month. Her savings account held barely enough to cover either one, let alone both. Losing the job itself was frightening, but it was not the worst part. She understood with a kind of exhausted clarity that an accusation of theft could follow her long after any investigation cleared her name. Wealthy families did not hire housekeepers with even a rumor of stolen jewelry attached to their names, whether the rumor was true or not. She allowed herself to cry only after Ava had gone to bed quietly so her daughter would not hear. But Ava was not asleep. She had heard the sound of her mother crying through the thin wall between their rooms, and it frightened her more than anything that had happened at the house that day. She lay there for a long time, turning something over in her mind before she got up and dug through the pocket of her favorite jacket until her fingers found the business card she had kept for months. She did not fully understand what she was doing. She only remembered that a man named Richard had once told her with a smile that she could call him if something fell apart. Her mother's tower had fallen apart. She found the spare phone Nia kept charging in the kitchen for emergencies, carefully pressed the numbers written on the back of the card exactly the way she had seen adults dial before, and waited. Richard was in a hotel room after a long day of meetings when his phone rang from an unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. When he answered, it took him a moment to understand that the small, serious voice on the other end belonged to a 5-year-old. Ava told him that her mother's tower had fallen down, that people said her mother took something, but her mother never took anything that was not hers. Richard sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake, and asked her to explain slowly what had happened. As Ava described security walking her mother out and people checking her bag and no one listening, when her mother tried to explain where she had been, something in Richard's chest tightened in a way he did not expect. He asked to speak with Nia directly. When Nia took the phone from her daughter, her first instinct was humiliation. She had spent the entire day being disbelieved by people with far less power than the man now waiting on the line, and some part of her assumed this call would end the same way. But she made a decision in that moment. She was not going to plead. She was going to lay out the facts the way she would to anyone who was actually listening. She gave Richard the exact time of the clinic appointment, the name of the physician who had seen Ava, the pharmacy where she filled the prescription afterward, and the receipt number printed at the bottom of that pharmacy slip. She spoke steadily without begging because she had already prepared every piece of that evidence earlier in case anyone ever asked. Richard listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he told her that he intended to look into this personally and that he did not believe the story he had been given added up. Nia thanked him carefully, still unsure whether his words would turn into anything real. After they hung up, Richard sat in his hotel room, turning the conversation over in his mind, increasingly troubled by how quickly and how completely his own household had convicted someone without asking her a single real question. He made two decisions before he went to bed that night. The first was that he would return home earlier than planned. The second was that he would open an investigation into the missing bracelet himself quietly, without informing Diane, because for the first time in a long while Richard Whitfield was no longer certain that the person managing his home was someone he could fully trust. Richard Whitfield landed back in Connecticut 2 days earlier than his original schedule, telling no one at the estate the real reason for the change. Diane greeted him at the door with her usual composed smile, already prepared with updates about the ongoing investigation into the missing bracelet. She told him the internal security logs pointed clearly to Nia Carter, and that she had already begun the process of formally terminating her employment and documenting the incident for insurance purposes. Richard listened, nodded, and said nothing about the phone call he had received 2 nights earlier. He wanted to see how far the story would stretch before he pushed against it. He asked Diane casually to walk him through exactly how the safe worked and who had access to it. She explained that the safe recorded each entry through a keypad code assigned to specific staff members, and that the log showed Nia's code entered at 9:40 the previous evening. When Richard asked whether the hallway camera near the dressing room had captured anything useful, Diane repeated what she had told the staff earlier, that the camera in that section had been malfunctioning for weeks and that maintenance had been notified but had not yet fixed it. She delivered the explanation smoothly, without hesitation, the same way she delivered every report to him. It was the smoothness of it that first caught Richard's attention. A house that ran this efficiently rarely had equipment failures no one had mentioned to him before. Rather than raise his suspicions directly, Richard told Diane he wanted a full incident report written up for his personal review, framing it as a formality for the insurance company. She agreed immediately and promised to have it ready within a day. What she did not know was that Richard had already placed a call to Gary Bennett, a former federal investigator who had handled security consulting for the Whitfield family for years. Gary had helped install parts of the estate's surveillance system originally, which meant he had contacts inside the manufacturer that had nothing to do with whatever internal logs Diane controlled. Richard met Gary privately in his home office that same afternoon, away from the rest of the staff. He explained the situation as plainly as he could, including the strange detail of a 5-year-old calling his personal cell phone the night before. Gary did not dismiss any part of it. He had spent enough years investigating internal theft cases to know that the person controlling the paper trail was not always the person telling the truth. He told Richard that if he wanted answers that could not be quietly altered, they needed to pull data directly from outside sources, not from anything routed through Diane's office. Over the following 2 days, Gary worked quietly in the background, while the household continued operating as though nothing unusual was happening. He contacted the manufacturer of the safe directly and requested the raw access logs stored on their end separate from whatever had been recorded in the estate's internal system. He also reached out to the company that maintained the exterior security cameras, since those systems were serviced independently and reported to a cloud server outside the house entirely. Diane had no reason to expect anyone would look outside the records she controlled, because in 7 years no one ever had. While waiting for that data to come back, Gary pulled something else that troubled Richard almost as much. He requested the personnel files for every member of the household staff, curious whether Nia's employment history contained anything that might explain why suspicion had landed on her so quickly. What he found was a pattern that had nothing to do with theft and everything to do with how she had been treated for years. Nia's file contained multiple write-ups for infractions that seemed almost absurd when read side by side. She had been noted for bringing her daughter into the kitchen on a daycare closure. She had been written up for using the wrong cleaning cloth in a guest bathroom. She had a note dated from the previous winter documenting that she left the property 4 minutes after her scheduled shift end. Gary compared these files against those of other staff members who had worked at the estate for a similar length of time. The difference was stark. Other employees had occasional notes in their files, usually tied to actual performance issues. Nia's file read like someone had been building a case against her long before the bracelet ever went missing, documenting the smallest possible infractions, as though anticipating a moment when they might be useful. Richard sat with that file for a long time after Gary left, uncomfortable with what it suggested about how his own house had been run in his absence. He thought back to the conversation with Nia on the phone, the calm and specific way she had laid out her alibi without pleading for sympathy. It did not match the picture Diane had painted of an employee who had grown careless or desperate enough to steal. It matched instead the picture of someone who had learned to defend herself carefully because she understood no one would defend her otherwise. The data from the safe manufacturer arrived on the third day, and Gary brought it to Richard's office without any preamble. He laid two documents side by side on the desk. The first was the internal report Diane had prepared, which showed Nia's employee code entered into the safe's keypad at 9:40 in the evening. The second was the raw log pulled directly from the manufacturer's servers, time-stamped independently and impossible to alter from inside the house. The two documents did not match. The manufacturer's log showed the safe had been opened using a biometric fingerprint scan, not a keypad code at all. Only one fingerprint was registered to that particular safe beyond the family's own. It belonged to Diane Sinclair. The employee code attributed to Nia had been entered into the internal system nearly 4 hours after the safe was actually opened, added retroactively in a way that made it appear as though her code had unlocked it in real time. Richard read the report twice before he said anything. Gary explained what this meant in practical terms. Someone with direct access to the internal logging system, someone who understood exactly how the software recorded entries had gone in afterward, and inserted Nia's code to create the appearance that she had opened the safe. It was not a mistake. It was not a glitch in outdated equipment. It was a deliberate alteration made by someone who knew the system well enough to make it convincing. Gary had one more piece of information he had been sitting on for several hours, uncertain how Richard would react. He had pulled financial records connected to Diane as part of a standard background check that Richard himself had approved years earlier during her hiring. Buried in those records was a pattern of significant debt that had grown substantially over the past year, totaling close to $100,000. Gary had also found record of two smaller pieces of jewelry belonging to the Whitfield family that had quietly been sent out for appraisal and never returned to the estate inventory, both authorized under Diane's signature months earlier. Richard sat back in his chair pieces, settling into place that had felt disconnected only minutes before. The strange phone calls Diane had been taking in the hallway, her reaction when he mentioned wanting a full inventory of family valuables. The camera excuse delivered too smoothly, too quickly, as though she had rehearsed it before anyone even asked. None of those moments had seemed significant on their own. Together, they told a very different story than the one she had presented to the staff. The bracelet, it seemed, was not a small or opportunistic theft. It was the largest item Diane had taken, likely because she understood her debts had reached a point where smaller items were no longer enough. And when she realized Richard might actually notice something missing this time, she needed someone else to blame quickly, someone whose word would carry less weight than her own. Nia fit that need in every way that mattered to Diane. She had access to the room. She held no real power within the household. She was in obvious need of her income, which made the accusation of desperation believable to anyone who did not look closely. And thanks to years of carefully documented minor infractions, there was already a paper trail suggesting she was somehow difficult or unreliable, ready to be pulled out the moment suspicion needed somewhere to land. Richard understood, sitting in that office with the fingerprint report in front of him, that this was not simply about clearing an innocent woman's name. Diane had built her plan around an assumption that no one would ever question a story that blamed a black housekeeper over a white woman in a position of authority, especially not in a house where Richard himself had been absent so often. That no one expected him to look closely at anything. The theft was Diane's crime. The silence that allowed it to work so easily belonged to something much larger than one dishonest employee. He asked Gary how many other people inside the house might have known enough to help alter those internal records, or who might have noticed something and said nothing. Gary told him honestly that he did not yet know, but that the security footage tampering alone suggested Diane had not acted entirely alone. Someone with access to the camera systems had allowed that excuse to hold up for as long as it did. Richard called Nia the next morning and asked her to come to the estate, this time not as an employee facing discipline, but as someone he needed to speak with directly. He offered to send a car, but Nia said she would drive herself. She wanted to walk through the front door on her own terms, even if just this once. Ava came with her, still holding the same stuffed rabbit, unaware of how much had changed since the night she picked up the phone. Richard met them in his office rather than the main hall, a small gesture meant to avoid another public spectacle. He laid out what Gary had found without softening any of it. He explained the fingerprint data, the retroactively inserted code, and the financial records tied to Diane. He told Nia plainly that she was innocent, that the investigation confirmed everything she had said from the very first night, and that he intended to correct this formally and completely. Nia listened without much visible reaction. She had expected relief to hit her the moment someone finally believed her, but what she felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, mixed with anger that had been sitting untouched for days. She asked Richard quietly but directly why her word had not been enough on its own. She told him she had given the same explanation to Diane, that she had given to him the same appointment time, the same receipt number, the same clinic that could confirm everything in 5 minutes. She wanted to know why none of that mattered, until a 5-year-old picked up a phone. Richard did not have a good answer, and he did not try to invent one. He told her honestly that he did not know, and that the not knowing bothered him more than he expected it to. He said that his absence from the house had allowed a system to form where people like Diane held all the authority to decide who was trustworthy, while people like Nia were left to prove their innocence over and over with no one required to actually listen. Nia did not respond right away. She simply let the silence sit there, unwilling to make it easier for him. Richard decided the correction could not happen quietly behind closed doors. He gathered the entire household staff into the main hall that same afternoon, the same room where Nia had been searched and humiliated days earlier. He asked Diane to explain in front of everyone exactly how the bracelet had gone missing and why she believed Nia was responsible. Diane repeated the same story she had told from the beginning, confident and composed, clearly expecting this to be another routine confirmation of her authority. Richard placed the fingerprint report on the table in front of her. He watched her expression change as she read it, the confidence draining out of her face in real time. For a moment she said nothing at all. Then, instead of denying what the report showed, she shifted her story entirely. She claimed she had only borrowed the bracelet, that she always intended to return it, and that this was never meant to become anything as serious as it had. The staff in the room stayed completely silent as Diane's explanation kept changing shape. She told Richard she was raising 2 children on her own, that the financial pressure had become overwhelming, and that she hoped he could understand the position she had been in. Richard let her finish before responding. He pointed out evenly that she was asking him for the exact compassion she had refused to extend to Nia, a woman raising a child alone under far greater financial strain than Diane had ever faced, without a fraction of Diane's authority to protect herself. He then turned to the rest of the staff and asked a simple question. He wanted to know who else had been aware that the internal records did not match what actually happened the night the bracelet disappeared. For a long moment, no one spoke. People shifted where they stood, looking at the floor or at each other, unwilling to be the first to answer. It was Amanda Reed, one of the younger housekeepers, who finally broke the silence. She admitted that she had heard Diane threaten to fire anyone who raised questions about the investigation once it was already underway. She said she had assumed the accusation against Nia must have been accurate since Diane presented it with so much certainty, and that she had not wanted to risk her own position by questioning something that seemed settled. A few others nodded along or added quiet variations of the same explanation. They had not actively helped Diane. They had simply decided it was safer to accept the story than to ask whether it was true. Richard stood in the middle of that silence, and understood more clearly than he had at any point in the investigation so far that the problem in his house was not limited to one dishonest manager. An entire culture had formed around the assumption that authority deserved automatic belief, and that people without power, especially someone like Nia, deserved automatic suspicion. No one in that room had invented that assumption on their own. It had simply been easier to live inside it than to challenge it. Over the following days, the investigation widened further than Richard had expected. Gary continued pulling records and speaking privately with different members of the household, and each conversation revealed another thread connected to Diane's cover-up. The head of household security admitted when confronted directly with the outside camera data that he had deleted footage from the night in question at Diane's request, believing it was a minor favor rather than part of covering up a theft. He said he assumed Diane had a good reason since she outranked him and had never given him cause to question her before. The estate's accountant, when Gary walked him through several discrepancies in the household's expense reports, eventually admitted that he had helped adjust certain records to explain away small amounts of missing money over the past year. He insisted he did not know the full extent of what Diane was doing, only that she had asked him to make specific numbers work out cleanly, and he had done it without asking too many questions because it was simpler than confronting her. Richard's own chief of staff, a man who had worked closely with him for years, was harder to confront because his failure was quieter. When Richard asked him directly whether he had received any complaints about how Diane treated the household staff, the man admitted that he had several times, but had chosen not to bring them to Richard because he did not want to burden him with what seemed like ordinary friction between a manager and her employees. He had not helped falsify anything. He had simply decided Nia's discomfort and the discomfort of others like her was not worth Richard's attention. 2 mid-level supervisors were the hardest for Richard to process. When pressed, both admitted they had known Nia's alibi checked out before the termination decision was finalized, since Nia had shown them the same appointment confirmation she later gave Richard. They had signed off on her dismissal anyway, believing it was not their place to contradict Diane once she had made her decision. By the end of that week, Richard understood that almost every person with any real authority over the household had in some form participated in or allowed what happened to Nia. Some had actively helped Diane cover her theft. Others had simply chosen comfort over honesty when honesty might have cost them something. The only person in the entire house who had refused to accept the story everyone else had settled into was a 5-year-old girl who did not yet know enough about the world to understand why adults so often chose silence. Richard terminated every person connected to the cover-up, including Diane, the head of security, the accountant, the chief of staff, and the 2 supervisors who had signed off on Nia's dismissal, despite knowing better. He handled each termination personally rather than delegating it, wanting to be certain there was no ambiguity about why it was happening or who had made the decision. He expected some sense of resolution once the terminations were finished, but it did not come. The people responsible were gone, yet nothing about what Nia had experienced was undone by their absence. She had still been dragged out in front of coworkers who chose not to speak up. Ava had still watched her mother's bag searched like she was a criminal. Firing every person responsible did not erase either of those memories. And Richard found himself sitting alone in his office that evening, with a quiet, uncomfortable realization settling in. He could remove every person who had wronged Nia from his household, but he had no way to command her trust back into existence, and for the first time in a long while he was not certain what to do next. Richard did not call ahead before driving to Nia's apartment 2 evenings later. He came alone, without an assistant, without a driver waiting outside, without anyone to soften the conversation he knew he needed to have. He had spent the past 2 days going over everything Gary had uncovered, and the more he reviewed it, the more he understood that firing everyone responsible had not actually solved the problem he was responsible for. Nia opened the door with visible surprise, glancing past him toward the empty street where no car service was idling. She let him in mostly out of habit, the same instinct that had made her polite to him for 7 years regardless of how she felt underneath it. Ava peeked out from the hallway, recognized him, and offered a small wave before disappearing back into her room, sensing without being told that this conversation was not meant for her. Richard sat at the same kitchen table where Nia had once tried to make impossible numbers work on a legal pad. He told her plainly that he had not come to ask her to forgive him, because he did not think forgiveness was something he could reasonably expect after everything that happened. He said he had come to take responsibility for something he had avoided facing for years, which was that he had built a household where one person held almost unlimited power over everyone beneath her, and he had simply trusted that power would be used fairly without ever checking. He told her that he had not personally accused her of anything, and that technically he had not been in the house the day it happened. But he said the word technically out loud only to immediately reject it himself, telling her that hiding behind his absence was exactly the kind of excuse that had allowed Diane to operate the way she had for years. He said he was done pretending that a quiet, smoothly run household meant a fair one. Nia listened without interrupting, her arms crossed, unwilling to make this easier for him simply because he had chosen to show up in person. When he finished, she told him that she appreciated him saying it, but that an apology delivered days later did not undo what had already happened in front of everyone she worked with. She said the hardest part was not losing her job. She had lost jobs before and recovered. What she could not shake was how easily every person in that hallway had decided she must be guilty without a single one of them asking her a single question first. She told him she was also afraid of something he might not have considered. If she returned to that house, people would assume she had only kept her job because she had somehow gotten to him personally through a phone call from a 5-year-old, rather than through anything she had actually done to deserve it. She did not want to walk back into that building only to spend the next several years proving she was not simply being protected out of guilt or embarrassment. Richard did not try to argue her out of that fear, because he recognized it as reasonable. Instead, he told her about the changes he intended to make regardless of whether she chose to come back. He was hiring an outside firm to oversee human resources, decisions across the household staff separate from anyone currently working there, so that no single manager could ever again control an investigation from start to finish without oversight. He was creating a direct reporting channel that allowed any employee to raise concerns to someone outside the house entirely, someone with no loyalty to whoever happened to be running daily operations. He said these changes were happening whether or not she accepted anything he was about to offer her because the failure went beyond her individual case. Only after laying that out did he tell her what he actually wanted to offer. He asked her to consider returning to the estate but not in the role she had held before. He wanted her to take a newly created position overseeing staff operations and employee welfare across the entire household with direct authority over hiring practices, working conditions, and how future complaints were investigated. It would include a significant increase in salary, full benefits, guaranteed hours, and a small residence on the property so she would never again have to choose between caring for Ava and keeping her job secure. He also told her that he intended to publicly clear her name not quietly, but in front of the same staff who had watched her be walked out days earlier. He would repay every dollar of lost wages, provide compensation for what she had endured, and offer to cover legal counsel if she wanted to pursue anything further against Diane or the others involved. Nia did not answer right away. She sat with the offer the way she had once sat with a legal pad full of numbers that refused to work, turning it over carefully rather than accepting it out of relief. She eventually told him she was not interested in a position that existed only because he felt guilty. If she came back, she needed every part of her authority written into an actual contract, something that could not be quietly overridden the next time a different manager decided her voice did not matter as much as theirs. Richard agreed without hesitation, telling her he would have legal draft whatever terms she wanted included, and that he would sign it personally rather than leaving it to anyone else in the household. Nia studied him for a long moment, searching for the kind of insincerity she had grown used to expecting from people in his position, and did not find it in the way he said it. She told him she needed time to think, not because she doubted the offer, but because she was no longer willing to make major decisions about her life out of fear or gratitude. Richard said that was fair, and left without pressing her further, understanding that trust was not something his apology alone could restore. A week later, Nia called and told him she would accept once every condition she had raised was written clearly into the contract. Richard had it prepared within days, and she read through it twice before signing, checking each line against what had actually been discussed rather than simply trusting his word a second time. The public correction happened exactly as Richard promised. He gathered the household staff along with representatives from the staffing agency that had originally placed several employees in the house and stated clearly that Nia Carter had never stolen anything, that the accusation had been fabricated to protect someone else's wrongdoing, and that the Maid household had failed her by accepting that accusation without question. He did not soften the language to make anyone in the room more comfortable. A year passed before the household fully settled into its new structure. Nia now walked the same hallways where she had once been searched in front of coworkers, but her role there had changed completely. She trained new employees on their rights within the household, explained the new complaint process to anyone uncertain how it worked, and repeated one principle often enough that it eventually became something close to a house rule. No accusation moved forward until it had been checked against actual evidence, regardless of who made it or who it was made against. Richard spent far more time at the estate than he ever had before. He had come to understand that hiring competent people to manage his home did not remove his responsibility for how they treated the people beneath them. He checked in personally, now not constantly, but enough to know that authority in his household was no longer something a person could wield unquestioned, simply because he was somewhere else. Ava kept the old business card in a small box beside her stuffed rabbit, the ink faded slightly but still legible. She never fully understood that her phone call had unraveled an entire cover-up and cost several adults their jobs. To her, it had always been simpler than that. She had made a promise to a man who once helped her build a tower, and when her mother's world fell apart, she had simply done what she said she would do. When someone eventually asked her why she made that call, she answered without much thought, the way children often answer the most important questions honestly. She said her mother always told the truth, and that day no adult around her had been willing to listen. The story closed on an ordinary afternoon with Nia holding her daughter's hand as they walked through the front entrance of the estate, the same door she had never once been permitted to use during the 7 years she worked there. Injustice in that house had never begun with open hatred. It had begun quietly, with someone being doubted a little faster than everyone else, believed a little less than everyone else, and left to prove their innocence to people who had already decided not to listen. A phone call could not erase every kind of prejudice in the world, but it could force the people holding power to finally look at the systems they had allowed to exist. If this story made you feel something, that's exactly why we tell them. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one, and if you've ever been the person nobody believed at first, you already know why stories like this matter.